There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's 3 a.m. on July 4, 1956, and 12-year-old Marlene is sound asleep, snuggled under her blankets to stay warm from the cool chill of a Sydney winter night. She shares a room with her grandma, their beds separated by a simple partition. Her mum and dad, brother, and aunt and uncle are also asleep in the house. Slowly, Marlene's bedroom window is eased open by a shadowy figure. He walks over to her bed holding a razor blade and slashes her blanket and bed sheets once, twice, 3 times. He keeps going until there are several large gashes up to 15 centimetres long. Luckily, none reach her skin. Marlene startles awake. "Hans?" she calls out, thinking the man at the foot of her bed is her brother. Spooked, the stranger jumps out the window and runs away. It's the first time he's attacked inside a home, but it's far from the first home he's entered uninvited. Most of the time, homeowners don't even know he's there. He sits in the shadows, in their lounge rooms, watching as people get up to go to the toilet, or stands in their bedrooms lurking as they sleep in their beds. His crimes will become more and more violent before he is stopped. Sydney will be terrorised 18 times across 3 years before police finally bring down the Kingsgrove Slasher. A case that over the decades has fallen through the cracks of history. Until now. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with journalist Glenn Humphreys. Glenn's worked for the Illawarra Mercury for more than 2 decades and has written several award-winning books. His book Night Terrors draws on hundreds of newspaper articles, as well as transcripts from court hearings that have been sealed since 1959 to tell the true story of the Kingsgrove Slasher. And just a note before you hear from Glenn, our conversation does include discussions of graphic violence, sexual assault and child abuse. If you find those things triggering, it might be best to give this episode a miss. Glenn, it's March 1956 in Sydney and a young woman named Margaret is hooking up with a man in her car. Tell me about what happened to her that day.
Well, they were parked in what was bushland then in Beverly Hills, which today is quite well built up. It was a hot night. They had their doors open, but they'd turned off the interior light for a bit of privacy. And they were sort of kissing, becoming a bit cuddly, and they didn't know someone was watching them. And he sort of crept up to them and actually slashed her chest with a razor several times and escaped.
So that incident, it's the first in what would become a crime spree. But does that initial attack make the headlines?
Not that I could find, no. And I guess when you think about it, if it happened at the time, it might only be a short news story. If that, she may not have wanted to make it public given the scenario that she's in a car with a man and it's, you know, the mid-50s. Perhaps there might have been some stigma about it so that she may have not wanted to, raise the alarm bells in that way. And certainly people didn't link it to the case of the slasher until several other crimes were happening. They realised this just wasn't a one-off.
We're going to reveal this guy's identity a bit later, but I think for context, it's super interesting right now to talk about the fact that all of these cases where he does attack people, they're kind of like the minority of what he's doing. Most of the time he's just prowling, right? He's just going into people's houses, like hundreds, thousands of people's houses and just prowling.
Yeah, that's by his own estimation. His background was, it seems he started just as a peeping Tom, just climbing over fences, watching people through their windows, then escalates slightly to him going into their house, standing in their bedroom, looking at them sleeping, sitting on the lounge in the lounge room, watching them as they get up to go to the toilet outside and come back in, before it escalates again And he then starts out by cutting their bed sheets, almost as a sign that he wants people to know he was in their house as well.
Well, after Marlene, the next victim is a young woman named Leslie Coleman, and that's 10 days later. And this time, it's a really violent incident. Can you talk us through it?
Yeah, it was quite a surprising one in terms of the violence. Leslie and her probably boyfriend were out late at night. The mum had left the door open for them to come home. They came home. It seems like the boyfriend didn't shut the door properly. So when the slasher comes around, the door is actually open. He walks in through the door. Leslie's sleeping in the guest bedroom. He slashes her a little bit, and then because she doesn't wake up, he wants to wake her up, so he punches her several times in the face, breaks her teeth, and knocks her unconscious.
It's just such an escalation from like slashing someone's top or slashing their bed sheets to like the way you talk about it in your book. It's like she's covered in blood, like she's almost choking. She almost dies.
Yeah, it's certainly quite serious. I think she might have had dentures at the time and the teeth were all broken. You know, she had to get surgery for other injuries to her face. I think there was also talk about blood splattered on the wall and on the roof at the time. I guess it's the strange thing about his crimes are that the first earlier ones are the violent ones. It's not towards the back end where it's more purely sexual in nature. I sort of took the assumption that maybe he's fighting those urges early on and they come out as violence, and then the sexual urges win over towards the end and he starts groping and accosting women without actually wanting to punch them or commit violence on them.
Before he gets to that, he does de-escalate a little bit. The next attack is a 7-year-old child and he just puts a gash in his pyjamas. And then the fifth attack is similar. It's a 12-year-old girl, and again he slashes her pyjamas and creeps into her room, all of the same stuff. But it's after that fifth attack on a young girl named Gloria that the media start to respond.
Yeah, certainly. I think they've sort of realised that there's something going on. Certainly the police roundsman at the time would have been told by the cops that something keeps happening and there's a similar modus operandi in each case. And so fairly soon after that, they start following it quite strongly. And a few cases later, we come up with the Kingsgrove Slasher nickname coined by the press.
Did the police have a description by this stage? Because they've got quite a few victims, quite a few people who have woken up to this shadowy figure.
They had nothing to go on at all because everyone had been asleep and maybe had only just woken up, so they're still half awake in a darkened room. He also sometimes would go into rooms and cut the pull cord from a light so the victim couldn't turn it on so she couldn't see. And it wasn't until a couple of victims later that someone actually got a look at him for the first time.
There'd be 13 more victims before he's caught, which is an astronomical number. But firstly, can you tell me about the false leads? Because women were coming forward saying that they'd been slashed or that they'd seen a man in their bedroom when they hadn't. Was that just part of the hysteria? Because Sydney was really on edge, right?
Yeah, certainly so. Certainly during, I guess, the second spree after the break, where it was really covered quite heavily in the papers, it seemed like everybody thought any noise outside was the slasher. People would say they heard someone at the back door. They thought it was the slasher. And it seemed people were also creating bogus attacks. There was one case where a woman said she woke up and the slasher had basically cut all the bed sheets, cut lampshades, cut everything, but she never screamed. And he was just in that room for so long, apparently, which was really nothing like any of the other crimes he'd done. Teenage girl said she'd gotten attacked twice by the slasher. In one case was really quite strange because the sister in the same room didn't hear anything, didn't get attacked at all. The family dog didn't bark. And in cases like this, police felt it was, I think they used the phrase, hysterical complaints, that people were either trying to get attention or were actually quite, worked up by the media coverage and the fear that someone was prowling around their area, that any little noise was someone coming to get them.
Well, it gets to the point where women are sleeping with weapons under their pillows.
Yeah, they took a whole lot of measures. Some of them were going to spray them with fire extinguishers or paint. People were going out armed with knives just in case something happened. And, there were also, vigilante groups were formed to sort of walk around in the streets and if they found someone, they'd race to someone's house to call the police, because back in that day, not everybody had a phone. So you had to find the one person with the phone to call the police to say they'd found someone. But all of those patrols really didn't come to anything. There was one instance where the main police officer who was investigating it found there was hundreds of people in the street with weapons looking out for what they thought was the slasher in their area. It actually turned out he wasn't even there at all at that time.
I know that you grew up around Kingsgrove, and that's kind of what drew you to this story. Have your parents spoken about that time, about what it was like?
I was inspired to write it because I had grown up in the Kingsgrove area quite some time after the slasher period and heard a lot of urban legends about what had happened. Even though the reality was quite extreme, the urban legends were much worse. So a couple of years ago, it just popped back into my head and I thought, well, the internet's here now. I can actually research and find out for myself what happened. But there wasn't much there at all because the case seemed to very much had slipped through the cracks. I had grown up in the same house that my dad grew up in, and he had been around with his two sisters around that time. And he recalls things like hearing police cars with their sirens blaring at all hours of the night, responding to various calls, remembers his sisters being quite concerned for their own safety. But I now know where the slasher's actual hunting ground was. They were far enough away that they were never in any danger, fortunately.
Tell us about the hunting ground. For those that aren't familiar with Sydney, where is Kingsgrove and the kind of places that he was hitting?
Basically on the East Hills line, probably about 20 minutes or so from Central Station. And I guess in the middle of the area is this big Wallay Creek parkland area, bushland, which became crucial to the whole slasher story because he would use that as a way to get from north to south to the houses. He would get off a train, cross over into the bushland, get changed, go out onto the other side and start prowling through houses. And if someone spotted him, or if several times it happened towards the end, the police turned up, he just would dive into the bushland and run away and would tend to escape.
The next crime in our kind of timeline that we were talking about is attacking a spare bed in a 1-year-old girl's bedroom. He slashes the spare bed. So there appears to be no victim profile here apart from being female. Like we've got women, children, now a baby. Were you struggling to see a profile there, or is it literally just women of any age?
Yeah, I think it's certainly female. He would always talk afterwards, he got caught, he would talk about it was a thrill of the chase that he liked so much, which sort of doesn't make sense given that you would think the person most likely to chase him is a man, but he never once attacks a man. It's always a woman. Even when the man's in bed next to her, it's not him that he attacks, it's her. Made me scratch my head about how he was actually picking them, whether it was he would just prowl around for a while and then decide this is the house and whatever was in there he was going to take potluck. And if it was a case where there was no person in there and it was just a bed, well, he was just going to slash that bed and leave his calling card. But he was fortunate. If he had been there an hour earlier, the wife of the family would have been sleeping in that bed and probably would have been slashed herself.
The next victim he chooses is a 16-year-old. So again, we're going back to someone who's not likely to chase him. Like, these are kids. They're teenagers.
Yeah, and that's an unusual one because she actually lived in his street. So you would think there is the chance that he must have known her or at very least seen her. He would have had to walk past her house on the way to the train station to go to work. She was the first one who actually saw what he looked like. He was in the room. She woke up and first thought it was her father in there. She saw him walk to the window, look out the window, making to see if he had been spotted and if he had more time. And then when he turns back, the streetlight outside catches his face and she sees that it's not her father and it's actually a stranger in the house. So she screams and that prompts the slasher to just jump out the window and run off. But that was the first inkling that they had some sort of concrete description of this person who was faceless until then.
Well, it seems like he's getting quite bold because if there's a possibility that he recognises her, then there's a possibility that she might recognise him.
Yes, there is absolutely that possibility. And, he knows where that street is. He knows where his house is. So it wasn't a case of him just stumbling on that house at random. He would have known how close he was to his own house. And she could have seen him walking to work the next day and recognised him. And this whole thing could have been avoided much, much earlier.
Well, maybe it's like you go back to that whole, is this the thrill of the chase that he's talking about?
Yeah, it could be. At one stage, he sort of felt like he was a mastermind. I think he was getting away with it, and he just sort of, gets more and more confident. And as is the case of so many criminals, they never think they're going to be the one who gets caught.
Valerie Thompson, she's the next victim, and he draws blood, slices her under her pyjamas. But I actually want to skip to the next victim in November, which is Rosalie Meyer. This one was one of his more violent attacks, and like you were talking about before, where he escalates to groping her.
Yeah, he enters the house, which is built from street side. It's built up on a high cliff where the road's been cut through. So at first it doesn't look like how he would have gotten in there. It's backs onto bushland, which is how he's getting in. He climbs in, he gropes her, slashes her, and has also carried a piece of wood into the room with him, which he said was going to be to chock open the door so he could escape. But he took it into the bedroom and hit her in the face several times. She obviously woke up at some stage because she had defense wounds on her fingers and hands from trying to ward off the blows as well.
And I should add, this is another 18-year-old, so a young woman. But I wanted to touch a bit more on when we say grope, he left marks, right? This is really quite violent.
Yeah, there are talk that people were left with bruises of finger marks on their chests. One instance I can remember, while he was groping, the woman tried to roll away and he was actually pulled into the room through the window. He was actually hanging on that tightly. So it certainly wasn't a light touch at all.
His next attack on 14-year-old Georgina is in a different location. It's actually north of the Harbour Bridge. And police find out later that's because the slasher moves. He moves house. But that would have been really scary for Sydney-siders because suddenly that net has widened all of a sudden out of Kingsgrove.
Yes, certainly he'd gotten married and moved to the North Shore, but people at the time thought he had extended his hunting ground and it wasn't just going to be, I guess, the western area of Sydney like Kingsgrove. Anyone could be at risk. Anyone in the city could find themselves with the slasher in their bedroom.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with author Glenn Humphreys about the Kingsgrove Slasher. There's one more attack on a 17-year-old back in his original hunting ground, and then he just stops. He stops attacking for an entire year. So I guess Sydney kind of gets lulled into a false sense of security. But you were talking about at that time, the police kind of assumed he'd been imprisoned or something like that.
It was a strange one that, for I think it was 455 days, there was no slasher reports. He has later said that he had tried to calm down for the sake of his wife. I think it probably also had something to do with that he wasn't living in his normal hunting ground, so it was harder for him to get to Kingsgrove, and he didn't want to attack anyone in the new area. And there was also the police looked at the time frame. There was a man who had been found hanging from his clothesline in the backyard, dressed in women's underwear. And when the police went there, they found a whole lot of women's clothing in his garage. So with the extended pause in the slasher, there was this thought that this guy, this executive from Sydney, was actually the slasher, and the reason they'd stopped was because he'd not killed himself. They declared it was autoerotic asphyxiation. But again, that turned out it wasn't him at all.
Yeah, well, he pops back up again, and his first attack back is another really violent one. It's on a 13-year-old called Robin. And this time he does, similar. He gropes, he slashes her, he punches her, but she actually wakes up with his hands around her neck.
Yes, he later admitted he couldn't remember doing that or couldn't even put out a reason why he had his arms around her neck. But I think you can reasonably conclude there can only be one real reason for that, is that he's trying to, hurt them, or at least maybe asphyxiate them or knock them unconscious, something like that.
Obviously, we know with hindsight that the way the slasher has moved house is kind of where he attacks. And again, there's another hiatus for 8 months because he moves home. He moves back to Kingsgrove area. And his next crime is on a 64-year-old woman. And he does nearly kill her, doesn't he?
Yes, that was one of the instances where I think in terms of the slashing, they generally victims would generally have some sort of cut because he would often be cutting through bed sheets or through pajama tops and the like. But Marguerite, I believe from memory, she had an overcoat over the top and a couple of blankets. And so he said he had to saw back and forth quite a bit to get through the clothing. The next day when he read the paper and realised the extent of the injuries, he was shocked because he didn't think it would have been that bad, but he'd actually left her with a 12-centimetre long cut across her abdomen and quite a bit of blood everywhere.
He commits 5 more crimes while living in the area. Are there any more that stand out to you, or they all kind of follow that similar pattern?
The 14th one, Elaine Kelly, I found a bit odd because it was a night where it was actually pelting down with rain, but it didn't stop him from going out. It didn't make him come home early. I think that attack was at about 4 a.m. So after a long period of it raining, he was still out there and still trying to find women to assault. That one, Kelly woke up and hearing a noise in the room and actually found out the slasher was lying on the floor next to her bed, which I don't think anybody wants to wake up and find a stranger lying on the floor next to him in their bedroom.
You can't get away from the creepiness. Like, of course, there's the violent aspect, but it's just so hauntingly creepy what he does.
Yeah, I've had people who have read the books, and the thing that scares them most is that idea of that he would sit in people's houses and watch them walk around. I think it's almost the not knowing that he might have been in there, that there was a stranger in there watching you is, I guess, more creepy than the actual attacks. And it was certainly the case that you could pretty much bet that if you're in a street and someone was a victim of a slasher, that it's highly probable he was in your house beforehand walking around as well.
Because he would walk in, like in a street, in a suburb, he would kind of go into every house, but then only attack one.
Yeah, it seems to be that case. It wasn't a case of him attacking several houses in a row. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know what the trigger was. I don't know what made him decide, okay, this is the one that I'm going to actually leave my calling card in, unless, the prowling was like a warm-up to get his thrills, and it got to a point where now it's the time to unleash.
What are slasher bars? Because they started to pop up in Sydney around this time.
Slasher bars are basically similar, if you think of prison bars, similar thing on the windows, but usually, unlike prison bars that are designed to keep people in, the slasher bars were designed to keep people out. So they're put on the outside of the windows to try and stop anyone from climbing through them. It got to the case where even the slasher's own wife insisted on having installed slasher bars on their own house because she was so fearful of the slasher coming in, but she didn't realise that he had a key.
So these bars, they weren't a thing in the 50s beforehand. It was directly influenced by the slasher.
Yes, it seems to be that case. There was no need for them before. And every now and again around the area, you can see a house that has these old-style bars on the window, and that's, a relic from these times. People would also nail their windows shut to stop anyone from getting in. But the surprising thing was, even with the talk of the slasher being around, that you couldn't have not known he was around. There were still people leaving windows unlocked. If it's a hot day, they left it open and slept with the window open. That really surprised me, that people still seem to think, it couldn't happen to them.
So we've got this elusive slasher. He's like a bogeyman that kind of is terrorising Sydney. How is he caught in the end? Police had hatched a bit of a plan, hadn't they?
Yes, Detective Brian Doyle, who had formed the Slasher Patrol after the second spate of attacks, had sort of come up with this theory that he was using the bushland in the middle of the area to escape into and to cut through when he wanted to attack. So they had a range of police officers. Some were, I think, called commandos who hid out in the bush. They had hot rods, which were people driving in fast cars. They even had lovers, which were 2 male police officers pretending to be man and wife, staking out various areas. Several times the police were called to an area for reports of a man ducking into the bush, and they pursued him but weren't able to catch him. And then it wasn't until a few months after his last attack that the police got a call to one house. And then while they were at that house, they got a call to another location, which was just a street away. So that they figured, well, this must be the slasher. And so they put their plan into place, which was they had a policeman standing on the hill in the park overlooking everything. They saw the slasher running through the bush. They radioed ahead to the two cops hiding at the southern area, and when they saw him coming down the hill, they raced up towards him. The slasher still wasn't keen on getting caught, so he decided to jump into a swamp nearby and try and escape that way. But I think the police, who had been spending ages in the bush at night, getting bitten by mosquitoes, getting cold, they weren't having a bar of that. So they jumped in thigh-deep water and basically grabbed him. And it was over.
And it was over. And I believe he said, "I'm your man, I'm the Kingsgrove Slasher." He just admitted it.
Straight away, yeah.
So the man in cuffs, his name was David Joseph Scanlon. Tell us about him.
Well, I think people always expect, criminals, especially someone who's been a bogeyman walking around the areas, slashing people, punching people, groping, strangling, is going to be some heinous monster. But he was actually just looked like an ordinary guy. You could think he was almost like a B-grade film actor in terms of his looks. He didn't look scary. He didn't look frightening. He'd grown up in Kingsgrove. He was the third child of a couple. His dad was apparently a somewhat violent man, wasn't easy to get along with. And it seemed that he was very much a mummy's boy. The mother and the son were drawn close together until she actually dies. And then that sort of seems to send him on a downward spiral that leads to the start of his crimes.
So he's in his late 20s-ish when he commits these crimes, isn't he?
Yeah, he's around that age. He was born in 1929, so by 1950s, he's, mid-20s, 30s.
And he's just got a regular job in the city. He's got a wife.
Yeah, he works in the city as a storeman in a company. He's married with a wife who, from all reports, had absolutely no idea of what he was doing at night at all.
Well, if he had a day job, it's quite bizarre because a lot of these crimes are on weeknights, aren't they? And in the really early hours of the morning.
Yeah, it seems for a guy who has a 9-to-5 job, you would have thought, Friday night, Saturday night would have been the obvious times for these attacks, but they're actually the least likely times he would attack. Most of them would be during the weekdays. And I think part of that may have been that he was able to use the ruse of working late. He'd tell his wife he's working late, so she would go to bed before he got home. Instead of working late, he'd catch the train back home at the normal time. Instead of going home, he'd go into the bush, get changed, and conduct his prowling for quite a few hours until he finally went back home.
When you say get changed, like he had a bag and he would just change into a dark outfit? What was he doing there?
Yeah, it was basically a jumper, trousers, and rubber shoes. And so he would take those to work, take them with him, walk into the bush, get changed, leave his work clothes in that bag, go off prowling for several hours and, jump back in the bush, grab his bag and head back home.
It's just so bizarre to think that he would have had, a pressed shirt and pants and shoes folded up in a bag somewhere under a tree while he went and took on this new persona almost.
Yeah, so it is quite strange. He's obviously, put a bit of thought into it. So he's woken up that morning, told his wife he's working late that night, taken his gear with him. He even went to the extent of, for his pay packet, if he's told his wife he'd been working late, he'd put in a few extra dollars into the pay packet so his wife wouldn't get suspicious that he wasn't earning enough money for someone who was supposed to be working all these late nights.
Many of these attacks happened while he was supposed to be sharing a bed with his wife. So she wasn't suspicious at all?
Doesn't seem to be, not at all. They said she was an early sleeper, would go to bed early and would sleep quite soundly. He was also a bit of a fitness freak. He would like to go running. So he said he would sometimes wait until she looked like she was about to go to sleep. And she would go to bed and he'd say, "I'm just going out for a run." And then he would come back, 12, 1, 2 o'clock, and she'd have no idea what time he'd gotten back in.
He asked police if he could break the news to her himself that he was the slasher. How did that go?
Well, he actually didn't want to break the news to his wife. He wanted the police to tell them for him. And the Detective Doyle took him to the house and they both stood in front of his wife, and Scanlon looks to Doyle as if to say, "Well, are you going to say something?" And Doyle says, "No, this is your wife. You've got the responsibility. You tell her." And he basically says, "Love, I'm the Kingsgrove Slasher."
What did she say?
I don't think she said anything. I think she was just struck completely dumb. She'd been living with this guy and had absolutely no clue that anything was going on.
When they got him back into the police station and actually started questioning him, how open was he about his crimes?
Well, I got the impression he was admitting to the crimes they knew of, so whether there were any others is always going to be unknown. He may have only committed 18, he may have committed much more, but figured, well, I'm only going to admit to the ones that you're actually bringing up to me. And even those ones that he did admit to, he didn't really seem to have any remorse or concern about, for instance, how the 7-year-old girl might have felt to be assaulted or how the other women felt by being bashed or strangled or groped. Anytime he was actually asked to try and dig deeper and explain his motives, he sort of fobbed it off and wouldn't actually give any sort of explanation.
Yeah, I was going to say that because he doesn't really explain why the young victims, apart from just saying he liked the chase, right? That's all he kind of gives.
That's all. Yeah, that's all he ever gives. That it was the thrill of the chase. Even though the whole 18 crimes, there's only one person who ever actually chases him, and that's the husband of Valerie Thompson. But he did like that so much that he later went back to their house and went around the side and started rattling things around in the hope of trying to get Ron to come back out and chase him again.
Bizarre. It's just such a hard crime to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it would be interesting if something like this had happened now, because there would be more psychiatric stuff and forensic psychology and more delving into it to find out the motives behind it, whereas that didn't seem to be the case really at the time. So you were really left wondering or having to guess what was the core motive for him.
Was his mental health looked at all as a factor here?
It doesn't seem to be so much because there wasn't any real trial. He'd actually pled guilty right off the start. He had the committal hearing where they went through all the crimes, and then they had the trial and he pled guilty at the start of the trial. So it pretty much then became just a matter of sentencing. Whether that was because he didn't want anyone to delve too deeply into the reasoning, that's not for me to say.
During the court process, did we hear from any of the victims about how they'd been impacted? Because it had been quite a few years and months since they'd been attacked by that point.
Yes, pretty much almost all of the victims took the stand at the committal hearing. Annette Gurney was one that wasn't there because she was in Queensland at the time, I believe. But the 7-year-old Anne, she wouldn't sleep on her own, wouldn't go to the bathroom on her own because she was scared of a person coming in through the trapdoor in the roof or hiding in the shower. Another teenage girl, Dale, she would be found hiding behind the lounge with her head in her hands screaming because she was just so terrified that he might come back. But also some of them weren't showing any great scars mentally or physically from the attacks. They seem to have stood up quite well.
What sentence did he get in the end?
He got 18 years. And even though he pled guilty, he later tried to appeal, suggesting the severity of the sentence was, I think he said it was a bit hot, quote unquote. The appeal court said, no, you've committed 18 crimes. There's no way you're getting a reduction in the sentence.
Am I right in saying that he laughed at his reaction? He gave quite a strange kind of response when he got that sentence, didn't he?
Yeah, he didn't seem to be too concerned or too upset, which does seem like a strange response to someone who's going to spend nearly 2 decades behind bars. It may well be that the reality of it didn't sink in for some time thereafter, or he sort of figured, well, I've done these crimes long enough. If I get caught, this is what's going to happen to me.
He was released in March 1970, so after 10 years. I'm assuming that's his non-parole period.
Yeah, he was released on parole in 1970.
What do we know of his life after prison?
I have found out a bit since writing the book because I've had basically his daughter, who was born afterwards, contacted me about it. So he apparently lived in Newcastle and then in the Picton for a while, found a woman who already had 2 children. They had a child together and he became a grandfather, and he is buried in Richmond Cemetery with a gravestone that I believe says loving father and grandfather.
Did his daughter give any insight? Because obviously she's seen the book, into what happened.
She felt quite sad for the victims, quite sad that her father had done it, but she'd mentioned that she never knew him as the slasher. She just knew him as Dad. And it certainly seems that I could not find any instances of any other similar crimes that had happened post-1970. There was talk that he was going to get a brain operation while in prison. I don't know whether that happened. Maybe it did. It could have just been that he was just too old, because he would have been 40-something by the time he got out. So might have just been too old to be climbing through windows doing that sort of stuff anymore.
At the end of your book, you share some of your own theories about him and his motives. You think he might have gotten a lot worse if he hadn't got caught.
I think there's certainly the possibility, because initially with the violence, it seems to me, well, normally you expect pattern of escalation from minor crimes to more violent ones. He was odd in that he started out violent. Some of his more violent crimes were at the start. And then towards the back end, they started to become less violent and more overtly sexual in nature. So with the groping so hard that, they're leaving bruises. So you do wonder, if he's let free that sexual component, that sexual urge, how long it would be before something worse happened and he had to escalate those sexual urges again.
Lastly, I wanted to ask, because you've investigated this case, this moment in time, this man so thoroughly, what are the lasting impacts that researching this and writing about this has had on you?
I think the thing that always left me surprised was, as a journalist, was just the different way they approached the victims, the media. Today, anyone under 18, you could not name them. Certainly not if they'd been a victim of a sexual crime, you couldn't name them at all. At the time, however, all these teenage girls were named, first, last names. The 7-year-old was named in the press. They had their photos on the front page of the paper. Some of them were described as pretty or very attractive, which just left a foul taste in my mouth, the idea that you would describe someone who's been a victim of that assault as pretty. And the coverage was even such that there were, addresses and street numbers were put in the paper, so people could quite literally walk up to a house where one of these victims lived and knocked on the door. And in fact, someone actually did that. Georgina Palmer, one of the few cases that he committed on the North Shore, the next day they got a knock on the door from a man saying he was with the Vice Squad and wanted to talk to Georgina. And the parents thought it was a bit suspicious. And so while he was talking to her, they rang the police, and the police came around and found out that he wasn't a cop at all. He was just some weirdo who wanted to come and talk to a victim. He ended up getting arrested, going to court, and was fined for, his interference.
So within a few decades, we've seen, obviously we've seen a change in the way police do things. They've got so many more things at their fingertips, so many more forensics, but we've also seen the way that these stories are covered change. Yeah,
certainly. I think this story, had it happened today, I think the story would still be covered more broadly in the same way. It would still make news. It would still be on the front pages of papers to have someone in an area for 3 years prowling around slashing women in their beds. But obviously names would not be allowed to be published. There would be some understanding of how the victims felt and try to protect them more than there was at the time.
Thanks to Glenn Humphreys for helping us to tell this story. If you'd like to read more about this case, you'll find a link to Glenn's book Night Terrors, The True Story of the Kingsgrove Slasher in our show notes. And a big thanks to Robert, who emailed us to request this episode. If you have a case you think we should cover next, get in touch with us via truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Barth. Our sound design is by Rhiannon Mooney, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you believe in what we do here at Mamamia and you want to support a purpose-driven women's media company, consider becoming a Mamamia subscriber. There's more information in our show notes.